On the 3rd of July 1796, Schiller wrote to his friend Goethe about the female figures at the end of the book, and he made the comment about Natalia that she is like an angel. She's holy and she's human at the same time, and he calls her a purely aesthetic nature. The last statement that Wilhelm makes in the book is that he has found a treasure he never deserved. I'm John Noyes, and I'm here to guide you through the reading of all of Goethe's novels. Wilhelm's story is the story of Bildung. It's the story of trying to develop yourself as best you can, bring out your full potential. It's also the story of the theatre, a love of the theatre, a misguided love of the theatre, confusion of truth and illusion, of acting and being oneself. There's another force that drives this novel forward, and that's the force of eros, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. From the very beginning of Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship years, Wilhelm is forced to confront the problem of illusion in the theatre. Now, as an actor, a would-be actor, an aspiring director, and an aficionado of the theatre, he's actually quite adept at talking about the creation of illusion on the stage. But when illusion bleeds over into everyday life, he is, at least to start with, remarkably naive when it comes to disentangling truth and illusion. And Goethe is going to unfold a rather interesting theme around the question of illusion and truth. It may be that Wilhelm is interested in truth as the opposite of illusion to start with, but as the novel progresses, we start to have to ask ourselves what the opposite of illusion might be. Is it really truth? Truth seems to be something that Wilhelm is not really prepared to take on board as capable of changing his life, of capable of determining the course of his life. And as the novel proceeds, we're going to find that the pursuit of truth takes second place behind the pursuit of correct action. And here in the writing of the novel, Goethe is a good Kantian, because this was precisely what Kant wanted with his critical philosophy. So if Wilhelm starts out with an easy distinction between truth and illusion, which he does in the first book, even while the narrator is ironically letting us know that Wilhelm has not quite understood this distinction, as the novel progresses, it becomes more and more complex to try and make this distinction. And there's a simple reason for that. That has to do with the uncertainty of whether truth resides in objectivity or in subjectivity. And another way of reading the theatrical motif in this novel is to see it as negotiating the subjective and the objective dimensions of truth. In the course of the first book of the novel, we begin to suspect that there is a certain way of playing the game of illusion, creating truth effects which might not be completely accurate, and that this is the actor's realm. But in Book 5, in conversation with Serlo, Wilhelm hears concretely that this is what acting is about. I'm going to read what Serlo says on page 186 of our volume of the collected works. Serlo says, "My experience has been that it is easy enough to set people's imaginations working, but much as they like to be told tales, their minds are rarely productive. This is especially so with actors. An actor is quite content to take on a striking and worthy role, but rarely does more than put himself self-satisfiedly in the hero's place, without any concern as to whether other people will accept that. But having a vivid comprehension of what the author of the play had in mind, and knowing how much of one's own personality one must efface in order to do justice to the role, sensing that one is oneself quite different, and yet having the power to convince the audience that one is what one portrays, having the ability by the compelling truth of the presentation to turn planks into temples and cardboard into forests, that is given to few. the mind's power to create illusion in the spectators, fictitious truth producing solid effects by aiming solely at illusion. Who amongst them can understand that? This final formulation is really what the theatre is about in Wilhelm's overall development. It's about producing truth effects, fictitious truth producing solid effects by aiming solely at illusion, illusion producing solid effects, illusion that enables correct action. But note the way Serlo put this. He speaks of how people's minds are rarely productive, but a productive mind in the way he's talking about it is a mind which is productive of illusion. So this is one of the lessons that Wilhelm has to learn from the theatre, is that a productive mind can produce truth effects through illusion. And this is heightened if illusions are collective illusions, as they are in the theatre. And by the way, this is where the political dimension of the theatre becomes important once again. Collective illusions creating truth effects and enabling action. Goethe has just seen in the past years how in the French Revolution this can lead to open violence, two results which to Goethe's mind were quite disastrous. And incidentally, we know a lot more today about truth effects and collective belief in illusion in the day of QAnon. We know a lot more about this than Goethe in his day. Or maybe QAnon looks similar to us than the French Revolution looked to Goethe. Goethe may have taken away this lesson from the theatre about truth and illusion and shared illusion and the positive effects of an illusion. But at the time he's interested in the theatre, it's not for that reason. So what is it that motivates him to become so enthusiastic about the theatre? What makes him want to invest so much psychic energy in the theatre? Well, the answer is quite plain from the very beginning. There is an erotic investment in the theatre in this novel. Wilhelm can speak the language of freedom and truth and a passion for his nation, but what he's really interested in is the erotics of the theatre. Goethe lays this out clearly from the very beginning. And one place where he does this in a rather amusing way is when he has Wilhelm read a poem to Marianne, who is sleeping in his arms. He thinks she's listening passionately to what he has to say, but she's fallen asleep. And Wilhelm is talking about a poem he wrote where the muse of poetry appeared to him. You'll find this on page 15, and I'm going to read what Goethe writes. He says, "I remember writing a poem, which must still be somewhere among my papers, in which the muse of tragedy and another female figure representing commerce were struggling for possession of my worthy self." We read these lines and we immediately have to think of the muse of tragedy, Marianne, and the figure representing commerce, Barbara. And Wilhelm, of course, doesn't realize this himself, but as he continues to speak, we can see it even more clearly. He says, "How timid was my portrayal of the old housewife with her keys and distaff, spectacles on her nose, always busy and bustling, quarrelsome and domestic, petty and pompous." That's commerce in William's eyes, and that is Barbara in Goethe's eyes, at least in the narrator's eyes. But how different the other figure was. What a vision for an oppressed spirit. Noble of stature, she was in every ounce of her being and behavior the true daughter of freedom. Her sense of herself gave her dignity and pride. Her garments suited her perfectly. The wide folds of her dress moved like echoes of the graceful movements of a divine creature. This is the muse of tragedy, the true daughter of freedom. And so we see that Wilhelm has an erotic investment in the muse of tragedy. And at the end of this paragraph, it's reinforced when he says to Marianne If only I could have imagined, Wilhelm exclaimed as he pressed Marianne close to him, that another and more lovely goddess would confirm me in my resolve and accompany me on my path. My poem would have turned out to be much better and achieved a far more interesting ending. But life in your arms is no poem, it is reality. Bitter words, ironic words. Life in Marianne's arms is not reality. It's not a poem, it is theatre. And it's going to take Wilhelm a long time before he starts to understand the erotics of his investment in the theatre. He's going to have to work his way through various relationships with the female figures in the novel until he's going to discover gradually that an investment in a female figure who is desexualized for him is possibly a better path to, if not truth, then to correct action than his investment, his erotic investment in some of the other female figures. So let me just briefly recount some of the erotic investments that are intimately tied up with the illusion of the theatre. Wilhelm's attachment to Marianne starts to look to him like an attachment to a fate which is going to drag him out of his middle-class life and lead him into the life he's intended for, which is the life of the theatre. And he says as much at the end of chapter 9 in book 1 on page 16. He says, fate, he decided, was extending its helping hand to him through Marianne to draw him out of the stifling, draggle-tailed, middle-class existence he had so long desired to escape. The next erotic attachment to the illusion of the theatre is even more explicitly unfolded, and it comes in the person of Philine. Philine is introduced as a lovely woman on page 51, and together with Laertes, they form what he calls the remains of a company of actors. The German says Trümmer einer Schauspielgruppe. So the German says they're the ruins of a group of traveling actors. So this flower that blossoms on the ruins provides a second erotic enticement into the world of illusion for Wilhelm. And the consummation of this erotic attachment to the theatre and to, we think it's Philine, comes at the end of chapter 12 in book 5, after the successful performance of Hamlet, page 198, when Wilhelm arrives home, and we read, Wilhelm threw off his clothes as soon as he got to his room, put out the light and dropped into bed. He fell asleep in no time, but was aroused by a noise which seemed to come from behind the stove. The image of the king in arms came before his heated imagination, and he sat up in order to address the spirit, only to find himself drawn back by a pair of tender arms, his mouth smothered by passionate kisses, and against his chest the breast of another that he did not dare to push aside. The German says, the breast of another that he didn't have the force to push aside. And then chapter 13 begins, and it says, his head was still fuzzy from that not yet dispelled intoxication of the evening before, and the memory of the unknown nocturnal visit made him uneasy. His first guess was that it had been Philine, and yet the charming body he had clasped in his arms did not seem like hers. Goethe can't resist setting up this little mystery around Philine, because just as if the erotic attachment to the theatre involves the illusion of what is behind the theatre, so his actual erotic liaison with this unknown and unnamed individual may be Philine, but it may also not be Philine. The next erotic entanglement of desire and illusion comes in the figure of the Countess. From the moment she enters the story, it becomes clear that something is going to happen between her and Wilhelm, and that something is attached from the beginning to the theatre, because the Countess is speaking to Philine, and Philine says, "There's quite a handsome young man upstairs who would do well as a jeune première. The German says he would do well as a first lover. And I think the translation should have included that explicit and ironic reference to what is to come. I'm on page 86. And Wilhelm walks into the room, and his eyes immediately encountered those of the Countess directed at him. Wilhelm bowed to the Countess and answered with some confusion the questions of this charming lady addressed to him. Her beauty, her youthful grace, her elegance and refinement of manner made the most pleasing impression on him. And this pleasing impression will last, and it is mutual. And the relationship is allowed to slowly and subtly intensify up to the point where they embrace in a scene which is shrouded in misunderstanding. The misunderstanding concerning why she has sent him away, why his embrace was too intense for her. But the erotic attachment to the Countess is brought into another, even more wicked, illusory game, and that is the little theater that the Baroness sets up, where Wilhelm pretends that he is in fact the Count, in order to find his way into a game that he only realizes too late is quite dangerous. If it succeeds, this game of setting himself up to look like the Count, and therefore arranging a secret liaison with the Countess, if it succeeds, it's dangerous. If it fails, it's dangerous. And it fails in a way that he couldn't predict, but with no less disastrous results. And when it comes to desire and the erotic attachment to illusion, the final female figure to play a role here is Teresa. Teresa, who Wilhelm thinks is the beautiful Amazon who rescued him in the forest, but it turns out she's not. She is instead replaced by her sister, or her half-sister, Natalia, who then becomes Wilhelm's partner. So we might think that this is what the female figures are about in this novel. They're about showing how erotic desire can lead one into illusion. But we'd be doing Goethe a disservice if we stopped there, because he builds in several devices to show that the double seduction of desire, seduction into eroticism and into illusion, is something which can be refashioned in order to become a part of this overall learning experience, or this overall self-development, which is the course of the novel. And the way this works is through the negotiation of one's inner desires, one's inner impulses, one's inner drives, and the constraints of the world around. And here we see a direct continuation of the problem of Werther. Remember, in Werther, we saw that love became something like a testing ground for the individual's ability to read inner impulses as inner nature. And then to ask questions, or at least for the reader to ask questions about the nature of the inner impulses. Are they distorted by desire? Are they blinded by desire? To what extent are they curtailed by social constraints? The drama of inner desires and social constraints is a very specific one in Werther, and the way it turns out is very much tied to his character. In Wilhelm Meister, Goethe wants to do something more generalized. He wants to remove the understanding of Wilhelm's quest from the person of Wilhelm's character and to generalize it so that it becomes a negotiation of certain concepts. And so around the female figures, he sets up a series of conceptual arrangements, conceptual constellations that have to do with art and illusion, with art as it relates to commerce, the muses versus the activities of money-making of the middle classes, the role of self-development in the nobility and in the middle classes, but also the nature of love. Love tending towards caritas, towards kindness and sympathy on the one hand, love tending towards eros on the other hand. And then also between what it means to be holy and what it means to be human. And the holiness theme comes as a surprise in Book 6 when we get to the Confessions of a Beautiful Soul, die Bekenntnisse einer schönen Seele. But this discussion, we will then see in the closing books, has a very important position in Wilhelm's development, because he is going to have to decide sooner or later what to think about fate, whether it is something beyond his control, guiding his life, like he thought to start with, or whether it's something that leaves him choices about how he's going to live his life. So one of the ways that Goethe is going to modify the understanding of women as the place of eros and illusion is to desexualize a number of the female figures by making them androgynous. And Michael Minden has something interesting to say about the role of androgyny in the novel. And I'd just like to draw your attention to page 45, where he says that in alchemy, as in other spiritual, philosophical, and mystical systems, hermaphrodism is a quality of perfection. Hence Mignon and Natalia in some measure reflect or embody the notion of perfection. And I think we can expand on this to say that every time a female figure is bisexualized or desexualized, then in this novel, then Goethe is hinting at a kind of perfection beyond erotic attachment. And returning to Minden, the second point he makes, which is interesting, is that the specter of incest, however, looms across the path to perfection. And this is because in the alchemical system, the only road to perfection was through death, either physical or spiritual. So here we can also relate what Goethe is doing to Werther, and it looks like he's asking the question, how does Wilhelm find the path to perfection without taking the route of death that Werther chose? And so he gives us a series of androgynous figures, starting with Marianne, who is introduced to the reader clothed as a man, and then moving on to the figure that the young Wilhelm identified most with in Tasso's play Jerusalem Delivered, the figure of Clorinda, who Wilhelm, looking back, describes as having an almost masculine femininity. And the German word, I think, is even better than this. Goethe uses the word Mannweiblichkeit. She possesses a man-femininity. And then there is the most striking figure of androgyny in the novel, and that is Mignon. Mignon, who is introduced to us in Book 2, Chapter 4, page 50, where we read that Wilhelm was going upstairs to his room when a young creature jumped out at him and immediately attracted his attention. The child was neatly dressed in a short silk bodice with slashed Spanish sleeves and puffed out long slim trousers. Its long black hair, and note the pronoun here is its. Its long black hair was curled and wound in locks and braids on its head. He looked at the figure with amazement, uncertain whether it was a boy or a girl. But he finally decided in favor of the latter and stopped her as she was rushing past. Now it's quite remarkable what Goethe does here. He introduces this creature, this androgynous, indeterminate creature as an it, but then tells us that Wilhelm decided that it was a she, and then the narrator starts calling it she, even though the only basis is Wilhelm's decision that Wilhelm's unfounded decision that Mignon is a she. And this continues then throughout the rest of the novel. Mignon becomes a she, but only because Wilhelm has decided. And it's worth looking in some detail at the descriptions of Mignon, because they always carry this indeterminacy. They carry an indeterminacy of gender, and they carry a seduction, if I can use that word, which is not erotic, a fascination with a mystery in which she is enshrouded. So we read on page 54, Wilhelm could not take his eyes off her. Her whole appearance and the mystery that surrounded her completely absorbed his mind and feelings. Then on page 61, the person and character of Mignon attracted him more and more. There was something strange about everything she did. She never walked up or down stairs, she always ran, etc., etc., etc. And then at the end of this paragraph, it says, he went home full of thoughts about this strange creature and unable to make up his mind about her. And one of the last times we hear from Mignon in the novel is in chapter 2 of book 8 on page 316, where she sings this song. She sings, so let me seem till I become, lasst mich scheinen bis ich werde. Scheinen is the word for illusion. Let me present an illusion, an appearance to the world until I can become. Let me seem till I become. Take not this garment white from me. I hasten from the joys of earth down to that house so fast and firm. There will I rest in peace awhile, till opens wide my freshened glance. Then I will cast my dress aside, leaving both wreath and girdle there. For all those glorious heavenly forms, they do not ask for man or wife. No garments long or draperies fine surround the body now transformed. And I just need to go back to the German for a moment, because the German says, und jene himmlischen Gestalten, sie fragen nicht nach Mann und Weib. So I don't like the English translation that says they don't ask for man or wife, because what the German says is they don't ask as to whether you are a man or a woman. Those glorious heavenly forms, they're not going to ask whether you're a man or a woman, because there are no garments that cover the body. Or I suppose we could say there are no garments that socially code the naked body as being either man or woman. And then we have the final androgynous figure, and that is the figure of Natalia, who appears as a beautiful Amazon coming to rescue Wilhelm and his party when they've been attacked by robbers. Marianne's androgyny is the fusion of being and appearance. It's the mixture, the fusion of acting the role and being who you are. And Mignon's androgyny is the androgyny of an enigma. And it's the androgyny of, I think we can say it, of a narrative enigma. And then finally, the androgyny of Natalia is the androgyny of the feminine force. It's the androgyny of a different way of conducting life than the masculine sphere, which plays such an important role in the novel. And this becomes very important towards the end of the novel, and we see it in a conversation that Wilhelm has with Natalia in Book 8. They are discussing her connection to the men of the Tower Society, and Wilhelm asks her, do you, in your instruction of your women charges, carry out the principles of these extraordinary men? Do you allow each human being to develop by itself? Do you let them search and lose their way, make mistakes, and either happily reach their goal or lose themselves miserably in the process? And this is precisely what we've been seeing in the Bildungsroman, is the story of this process of either finding your way or losing it. And What Goethe does here is really quite, it's really quite sophisticated, and it's quite subtly done, because if this was where Wilhelm's story was intended to go, if this was its purpose, its end goal, its telos, then he could have already ended the novel. But instead he chose to lift Wilhelm out of the sphere of these extraordinary men and bring him instead into the feminine sphere of Natalia's life, which, as Minden argues, is the sphere of the ethical and the universal. It's not the sphere of the pedagogical, like the Tower Society is. It's not aimed at teaching and training and educating, but it's aimed at applying a universal principle. We could say it's aimed at morality, at correct action. And Natalia says as much in her response. She says, "It seems to me of the utmost importance to enunciate certain principles and inculcate these into children, principles that will give their lives some stability. I would almost be inclined to say that it is better to err because of principles than to do so from arbitrariness of nature." And so if the pedagogy of the Tower Society represents the epitome of Enlightenment thought, a celebration of rationality in the education of individuals, then Goethe is going to be emphasizing the necessity to move beyond this, and the direction in which he wants Wilhelm to move and which he wants the reader to move in is towards a harmonization of the capacity of reason and the inner drive. And this is where he starts to locate what he thinks of as the feminine principle. Just have a look at something else that Natalia says to Wilhelm. If you look at page 330, that's book 8, chapter 5. She's talking about her uncle, and she says, "It's not my fault," he used to say, "if I have not completely been able to harmonize my mind and my instincts." Just looking at the German says, "Meine Schuld ist es nicht, wenn ich meine Triebe und meine Vernunft nicht völlig habe in Einstimmung bringen können." Meine Triebe und meine Vernunft. So he says, it's not my fault if I haven't been able to harmonize my drives and my reason. And then he goes on to talk about Natalia. That is, in Natalia's recounting of the conversation, he goes on to talk about Natalia, and he says, "He would make fun of me and say, 'Natalia can truly be said to be in a state of bliss on this earth, for her nature never demands anything but what the world desires and needs.'" So this is how we need to understand the role that Natalia's feminine force plays in this novel. It's made to stand in for, perhaps we could even say it's made to symbolize a kind of a universal harmony between the power of the drives and the power of reason. And here it is quite tempting to jump straight to Freud's psychoanalysis, straight to Freud's topology of the human psyche, where the self emerges in a balance between the drives and the authority of reason. Or to put it in his words, the ego takes shape between the id and the superego. I don't want to claim that Goethe is putting forth a Freudian argument, but I think it's worth thinking about his book in these terms. So we've seen how he develops this idea of a feminine principle, a principle which is going to be so very important to him throughout his life, to the point where the concluding words of his life's project, Faust, will be, "Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan." That the eternally feminine draws us onward and upward. Next week, we're going to be making a transition from Wilhelm Meisters Lehrjahre to the Wahlverwandtschaften. to elective affinities. And what's going to make the transition is 2 points. It's going to be, first of all, the question of interpretation, because after all, Wilhelm's story is not only a story of a developing and a learning personality, but it's a story of someone who is coming to learn more and more that a life is nothing but the story of a life. And then also the attempt to shed desire and to reach this kind of balance that I just talked about is not quite as easy as we might think, and that's what we're going to discover when we turn to elective affinities. That's all for today. I'll see you next time, and I'll say auf Wiedersehen.